A 16-year-old boy excited for his first solo trip stands in the priority boarding line, his ticket clutched in his hand. But to the flight attendant staring him down, he isn't a passenger. He's a problem. Her voice, sharp and laced with suspicion, cuts through the airport noise, labeling him a stowaway for everyone to hear. He's dragged away by security, humiliated and terrified. They have no idea they've just detained the nephew of the most powerful woman in American transportation. The phone call he's about to make won't just clear his name, it will unleash a storm of justice that will bring an entire airline to its knees. The air in the terminal at Dulles International Airport was thick with the usual cocktail of emotions, the weary resignation of seasoned business travelers, the giddy anticipation of families heading on vacation, and the low-humming anxiety of those like Dylan Hayes, who were flying alone for the first time. At 16, Dylan stood at a lanky 6'1", all sharp angles and youthful energy, dressed in a comfortable but clean grey hoodie jeans and a pair of coveted Nike sneakers that had taken him months to save for. In his hand, he clutched his boarding pass for Oceanic Airlines Flight 815 to Portland, the crisp paper already starting to soften with the sweat from his nervous palm. This trip was a rite of passage. He was going to visit his cousins for 2 weeks, a journey he had meticulously planned and eagerly awaited. His Aunt Celine Hayes had insisted he fly first class. "It's your first time alone, sweetie," she had said over the phone, her voice warm, but with that familiar undertone of authority that commanded rooms Dylan couldn't even imagine. "I want you to be comfortable. Just be polite, do as you're told, and call me when you land." Dylan had felt a little guilty about the expensive ticket, but his aunt had waved off his concerns. She was always doing things like that, grand gestures of love that made him feel both cherished and a little overwhelmed. He didn't really understand her job, something big in Washington, D.C., involving a lot of meetings and policy, but he knew it was important, and he knew she loved him fiercely. She had been more like a mother to him than an aunt since his own mum passed away when he was 10. He found his gate C-26 and checked the monitor. The flight was on time. A wave of relief washed over him. He found a seat near the window and pulled out a book, trying to look nonchalant, like a person who flew first class all the time. He watched the ground crew buzzing around the massive Boeing 777, parked at the jet bridge, its Oceanic Airlines logo, a stylized blue wave gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Soon the pre-boarding announcement crackled over the intercom, calling for passengers with disabilities and families with young children. Dylan's heart began to beat a little faster. Then came the call he was waiting for. "We are now pleased to invite our first-class passengers to begin boarding." Taking a deep breath, he stood up, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. He joined the short queue forming at the gate, his ticket and ID ready. The line was mostly composed of men in sharp suits, their faces buried in their phones, and a few older couples dressed in expensive-looking travel wear. Dylan, with his hoodie and youthful nervousness, felt a pang of self-consciousness. He felt like an imposter. That feeling solidified into something colder and more uncomfortable when he met the eyes of the flight attendant, standing just past the gate agent's podium. She was a woman in her late 40s, with blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun and a slash of bright red lipstick that seemed to accentuate her thin, disapproving lips. Her name tag read Karen. Karen's eyes swept over Dylan, a flicker of something annoyance, disbelief crossing her features. Her gaze lingered on his hoodie, his sneakers then travelled back to his face. It was a look he knew all too well, one he'd seen in convenience stores when he was just browsing, or from neighbours when he was walking in quieter, wealthier parts of his own city. It was a look that sized him up and found him wanting a look that questioned his very right to be there. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the gate agent, a younger man named David, who seemed harried and distracted. David scanned his boarding pass with a beep. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Hayes," he said mechanically, not even looking up. Dylan murmured a "thank you" and stepped forward, but Karen moved to intercept him, blocking his path to the jet bridge. She held up a perfectly manicured hand. "Just a moment," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, but with an edge of steel. "I need to see that." She gestured toward his boarding pass. Puzzled, Dylan handed it over. He had already been cleared by the gate agent. What was the problem? Karen examined the ticket, turning it over in her hands, as if checking for forgery. Her eyes narrowed. "Seat 2A, first class." She said the words slowly, not as a statement of fact, but as an accusation. She looked up from the ticket, her gaze locking onto his cold and dismissive. "There must be some mistake," she stated, her voice loud enough for the other passengers in line to hear. "This is the first-class boarding group." Dylan's face flushed with a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. Heads were turning. The businessmen behind him were starting to look impatient. "There's no mistake," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "That's my seat." My aunt booked the ticket. Karen let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Your aunt," she repeated, drawing out the words mockingly. "Honey people don't just book these seats. Are you sure you're at the right gate? Economy boarding hasn't started yet." The humiliation was a physical thing now, a hot wave creeping up his neck. He was being treated like a child, or worse, a liar. "I am at the right gate," he insisted, forcing himself to meet her condescending stare. "My name is Dylan Hayes. That's my ticket. That's my seat." "Unlikely." Karen sniffed, holding the boarding pass away from him, as if it were contaminated. She turned to David, the gate agent, who was now watching the exchange with a weary expression. "David, can you check this? Something's not right here. This young man seems to think he belongs in the front of the plane." The implication was clear, hanging in the air like toxic fumes. This young man doesn't belong here. The other passengers were now openly staring, their expressions ranging from curiosity to annoyance at the delay. Dylan felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, dissecting him, judging him. He wanted the floor to swallow him whole. This was supposed to be an exciting adventure, his first taste of independence. Instead, in the space of 30 seconds, it had turned into a public spectacle of shame, all because of the color of his skin and the clothes on his back. He was no longer a passenger. He was a problem to be solved. And Karen, with her tight bun and cruel smile, had just appointed herself the judge. David, the gate agent, sighed, clearly annoyed at being dragged into the confrontation. He had a long line of impatient travelers to manage, and Karen's theatrics were causing an unnecessary bottleneck. "Karen, his ticket scanned fine. It's a valid first-class seat. Let him through." But Karen was not to be deterred. She held the boarding pass aloft, like a piece of evidence. "A valid scan doesn't mean it's his ticket, David. It's incredibly easy for someone to pick up a dropped boarding pass, or to acquire one." She let the insinuation hang in the air, her eyes flicking back to Dylan, dripping with suspicion. "He doesn't have any luggage to check, just a backpack. It's suspicious." Dylan's jaw tightened. "I have a carry-on. My checked bags were sent ahead with my cousins," he explained, his voice tight with frustration. It was true. To make his solo journey easier, his aunt had arranged for his larger suitcases to be shipped to Portland. But in Karen's narrative, this perfectly reasonable explanation was just another piece of incriminating evidence. "Sent ahead?" Karen scoffed, sharing a disbelieving look with a nearby passenger, a man in a pinstripe suit who offered a slight conspiratorial smirk in return. How convenient. The public humiliation was escalating, feeding on itself. Dylan felt his cheeks burn. He was being painted as a thief, a trickster in front of an audience. "I can show you my ID," Dylan said, reaching for his wallet. "It matches the name on the ticket. Dylan Hayes." "I'm sure it does," Karen said, with a dismissive wave of her hand, as if a piece of identification was a trifle easily forged. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, but it was deliberately loud enough to be heard by everyone around them. "Look, we have a serious problem with stowaways trying to sneak onto planes, especially international hubs like this. They are getting more and more clever. They dress the part, they have stories prepared. They count on us being too busy or too politically correct to challenge them." The phrase hung in the air, charged and ugly. Politically correct. It was a shield, a justification for the prejudice she was displaying so openly. She wasn't being racist. She was just being cautious. The dam of Dylan's patience, already strained, finally broke. The fear and embarrassment curdled into anger. "Stowaway, are you serious?" he exclaimed, his voice rising in disbelief. "I have a ticket. I have my ID. What more do you want from me?" His outburst was exactly what Karen seemed to be waiting for. It confirmed her suspicions. The boy was getting agitated, defensive, classic signs of guilt. "Lower your voice, young man," she commanded, her tone turning sharp and authoritative. "You are causing a scene and disrupting the boarding process. If you can't provide a satisfactory explanation for how you came to be in possession of this first-class ticket, I will have to call security." "A satisfactory explanation?" Dylan repeated, his mind reeling. "I already told you my aunt bought it for me. Her name is Celine Hayes. You can look it up in the reservation system." David, the gate agent, finally seemed to decide that the situation required more than a passive sigh. He turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The other passengers were muttering now, their impatience growing. "Just let the kid on the plane," one man grumbled, "or get him out of the way." After a few moments of tense silence, David looked up, his expression unreadable. "The ticket was purchased with a credit card under the name Celine Hayes," he confirmed. "It's a corporate account with the Department of Transportation." For a fleeting second, Dylan thought this would be the end of it. The facts were there in black and white on the screen, but he had underestimated Karen's commitment to her narrative. She leaned over the counter, peering at David's monitor. "Department of Transportation. So he's claiming his aunt is a government employee. That's the story he's going with." She straightened up, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "That just makes it more suspicious. It's a perfect cover. It sounds official. It sounds important. He's probably counting on us being too intimidated to question it." She turned her full attention back to Dylan, her eyes narrowed into slits. "I'm not intimidated," she declared, her voice ringing with self-righteous certainty. She pointed a finger at him. "I believe this individual is a potential stowaway. He has no checked luggage. He's giving us a suspicious story about a high-powered aunt, and he became aggressive when questioned. He could be a security risk. I am officially requesting that you deny him boarding and call airport security." David looked from Karen's determined face to Dylan's stunned and angry one. He was caught. Challenging Karen, a senior flight attendant with a reputation for being vindictive, could mean trouble for him, but denying a legitimate first-class passenger boarding was also a serious issue. He chose the path of least resistance, the one that absolved him of responsibility. "All right," David said, his voice flat. He reached for the phone. "I'll call them." Dylan stood frozen, the word "stowaway" echoing in his head. It was an absurd, nightmarish accusation. He was a teenager with a valid plane ticket, and suddenly he was being treated like a criminal. The other passengers in the first-class line were being ushered around him, now guided onto the plane by another flight attendant, who shot him a look of pity. They averted their eyes as they passed, as if he were contagious. He was alone, standing in the middle of the gate area, as David spoke quietly into the phone. Karen watched him, her arms crossed, a smug, triumphant look on her face. She had won. She had identified the threat, neutralized it, and protected her plane. In her mind, she was a hero. To Dylan, she was the face of a prejudice so deep and so casual that it could turn his dream trip into a living nightmare with a single, weighted glance. 2 airport police officers were already approaching from down the concourse, their walk purposeful, and their expressions stern. The nightmare was just beginning. The walk from the gate to the security office was the longest, most humiliating journey of Dylan's life. Flanked by the 2 uniformed officers, he was a spectacle. Every head in the bustling concourse turned to watch the procession, the tall black teenager in a hoodie being escorted away by law enforcement. The whispers and stares felt like physical blows. People clutched their bags a little tighter, pulled their children a little closer. In their eyes, Karen's accusation had already become a conviction. He wasn't just a suspect, he was guilty. The security office was a small, windowless room, tucked away in a sterile corridor, a world away from the bright, open terminal. The air was stale, smelling of disinfectant and lukewarm coffee. The room contained nothing more than a scuffed metal table and 3 chairs. One of the officers, a burly man with a thick mustache named Officer Miller, gestured for him to sit. The door clicked shut behind them, the sound echoing with a terrifying finality. "Empty your pockets onto the table," Miller commanded, his voice, a gravelly baritone that left no room for argument. "And take off the backpack, slowly." Dylan complied, his hands trembling slightly. He placed his wallet, phone, and keys on the table. He slid his backpack off and set it down. The second officer, younger and leaner, began to methodically go through the contents of the bag: a novel, a pair of headphones, a bag of gummy bears, a sketchbook, and a portable charger. It was the mundane inventory of a teenage boy, yet they examined each item as if it could be part of some elaborate criminal plot. "So," Miller began, leaning back in his chair, which groaned under his weight. He picked up Dylan's ID. "Dylan Hayes, and you were trying to board Flight 815 to Portland." "I wasn't trying to—" Dylan said, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing a steadiness he didn't feel. "I had a ticket. I was boarding. That flight attendant, she just decided I didn't belong." Miller exchanged a look with his partner. It was a look of weary skepticism. They'd heard 1,000 stories in this room, and they were disinclined to believe any of them. "The flight attendant, a 20-year veteran of the airline, said you were acting suspicious and became aggressive," Miller stated flatly. "She believes you're a stowaway, that you found or stole a boarding pass and were trying to bluff your way onto the flight. So let's start there. Where did you get the ticket?" "My aunt bought it for me." Dylan repeated the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. He felt like a broken record. "Her name is Celine Hayes. She works for the Department of Transportation. The gate agent confirmed it. He saw the corporate account." "The DOT is a big place," Miller said, unimpressed. "Lots of people work there. Doesn't mean they're buying first-class tickets for their nephews. Do you have your aunt's phone number?" A flicker of hope ignited in Dylan's chest. Yes, I do. Can I call her? She'll explain everything." Miller held up a hand. "We'll do the calling." "What's the number?" Dylan recited his aunt's personal cell number. The younger officer keyed it into his phone and hit dial. The room was silent, except for the faint, tinny sound of the phone ringing on the other end. It rang and rang and rang. Then voicemail. "You've reached Celine Hayes. I'm unable to take your call right now, but please leave a message." Her voice, usually a source of comfort, filled the small room, but it only served to deepen Dylan's despair. She was probably in a meeting, one of the important ones where all phones had to be off. The officer hung up. No answer. The flicker of hope died. "She's at work," Dylan said desperately. "She's probably in a meeting. Can you just, I don't know, look her up? She's important. I think she runs the whole thing." Miller let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Runs the whole thing. Kid, everybody we bring in here has a cousin who's a Navy SEAL or an uncle who's the chief of police. It's a tired story. Let's try again. The truth this time. Did you find the ticket? Did a friend give it to you? The more you lie, the worse this gets for you." Tears of frustration and fear pricked at the corners of Dylan's eyes. He blinked them back fiercely. He would not cry in front of these men. "I am telling you the truth," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and helplessness. "My name is Dylan Hayes. My aunt is Selena Hayes. She is the United States Secretary of Transportation." He said the full title, hoping the weight of the words would finally break through their wall of disbelief. He had only a vague understanding of what the title meant, but he knew it was the most important thing about her job. The two officers stared at him for a beat, and then Miller started to laugh. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was deep and condescending, the laugh of a man who thought he'd just heard the most ridiculous lie in his entire career. "The Secretary of Transportation," Miller wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. "Oh, that's a new one. I'll give you points for creativity, kid. You really went for the top shelf with that one." The younger officer shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "He's just digging himself a deeper hole." The condescension was worse than any accusation. They didn't just think he was lying, they thought he was a fool. Every word he said, every attempt to prove his own identity, was being twisted and used against him. He was trapped in a nightmare of someone else's making a narrative of suspicion that had been written the moment Karen laid eyes on him. He slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him. What was the point? They had already decided who he was, a black kid in a hoodie, trying to scam his way into first class, a stowaway, a liar, and now a delusional one who claimed his aunt was a cabinet member. His flight was scheduled to take off in 20 minutes. He could almost hear the final boarding call, the hum of the engines, the sound of his vacation, his rite of passage leaving without him. He was stuck in a windowless room, his identity stripped away, his future for the day, and perhaps longer, in the hands of men who saw him not as a person, but as a punchline. The silence in the room pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. An hour crawled by. The sounds of Flight 815 taxiing and taking off had long since faded, a mournful reminder of where Dylan was supposed to be. He remained in the sterile interrogation room, the officers having left him alone, to think about his story. They had taken his phone, placing it on the corner of the table, just out of reach, a symbol of his isolation. He had asked again to call his aunt, but Officer Miller had just shaken his head. "We're not playing that game anymore, son. We're waiting for a juvenile transport unit." The word sent a fresh jolt of terror through him. Juvenile transport. That meant a holding facility. It meant charges. This was spiraling into something far more serious than a missed flight. He was no longer just a stowaway. He was on the verge of becoming a criminal statistic. Desperation clawed at his throat. He had to do something. When the younger officer re-entered the room with a cup of water, Dylan saw his chance. "Please," he begged, his voice raw. "Just one phone call. That's my right, isn't it? I get one phone call. Let me try my aunt again. Please. If she doesn't answer, I won't ask again." The officer hesitated, looking at the dejected teenager. Perhaps it was a flicker of pity, or maybe just a desire to follow procedure to the letter. He glanced toward the door, then shrugged. Fine. One call. That's it. He pushed the phone across the table. Dylan's fingers fumbled as he unlocked the screen, his heart pounding against his ribs. He navigated to his favorites and pressed the picture of him and his Aunt Selene, both of them grinning at a family barbecue. He put the phone on speaker as the officer insisted and listened to the agonizingly slow rings. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. He held his breath, praying. On the 4th ring, the connection clicked. Dylan, honey, is everything all right? I saw you called earlier, but I was in a meeting with the president. I just got out. Did you land already? The sound of her voice, calm and familiar, was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. Relief washed over him so intensely, his knees felt weak. Aunt Evie. He choked out the name he used when he was little. No, I'm not in Portland. I'm still at Dulles. The tone of Selene's voice shifted instantly, the casual warmth replaced by a sharp, focused concern. What's wrong? Did you miss your flight? Are you hurt? I'm in a security office. Dylan said the words, tumbling out in a rush. They wouldn't let me on the plane. The flight attendant said I was a stowaway. She said I stole the ticket. They brought me to this room and they don't believe me. They think I'm lying about who you are. They're going to send me to a juvenile facility. For a moment, there was complete silence on the other end of the line. The officer in the room shifted his weight, a flicker of uncertainty on his face, for the first time. The voice on the phone had sounded authoritative. When Selene Hayes spoke again, her voice was glacially calm, but underneath it was an ocean of pure, distilled fury. It was a tone that made generals tremble and senators sit up straight. It was the voice of command. Dylan, she said, her voice dangerously level. Put the person I'm speaking with on the phone. Now. Dylan looked at the officer, his eyes wide. She wants to talk to you, he whispered, pushing the phone across the table. The officer picked it up hesitantly. Ma'am, this is Officer Dean with the MWAA police. Your nephew is... He was cut off by Selene's voice, which sliced through the air like a razor. Officer Dean, I want your name and badge number. I also want the name and badge number of every single person who has interacted with my nephew since he arrived at Gate C-26. You have 60 seconds to provide it to me before I call the Chief of Airport Police, who I had dinner with 2 nights ago, and the head of the TSA, who is currently on my speed dial. Do you understand me? Officer Dean's jaw went slack. His face paled. The casual arrogance was gone, replaced by a dawning horror. He stammered out his name and badge number, then Miller's. Good, Selena's voice snapped. Now listen to me very carefully. You are currently illegally detaining a minor. That minor is my nephew Dylan Hayes. I am Selene Hayes. If you need confirmation, I suggest you Google the name United States Secretary of Transportation. You are to release him immediately. You are not to ask him any more questions. You are to return all of his property. The head of security for this airport, the CEO of Oceanic Airlines, and a team from my own office will be at your location in less than 15 minutes. Am I making myself clear? Yes, ma'am. Dean squeaked, his eyes wide with panic. Crystal clear. Do not hang up this phone, she commanded. Stay on the line with me until my people arrive. Dean held the phone to his ear as if it were a live grenade. He frantically motioned to Officer Miller, who had just walked back in, looking confused. Dean whispered urgently, his face ashen. Miller's eyes widened in disbelief, then darted to Dylan, then back to the phone. He pulled out his own phone and quickly typed something into the search bar. Dillon watched as the color drained from Miller's face. He saw the screen. There, under the search results for United States Secretary of Transportation, was a picture of his Aunt Selene, smiling professionally, the same woman from his phone's contact picture. The entire dynamic of the room had shattered and reassembled in an instant. The power had shifted so completely, so seismically, it was almost dizzying. Dillon was no longer a stowaway, a liar, a punchline. He was the nephew of the woman who held the entire nation's transportation infrastructure in her hands. The two officers looked at him now not with suspicion or condescension, but with pure, undiluted terror. They had made a mistake, a colossal, career-ending mistake, and the consequences of that mistake were now rocketing toward them at the speed of a cabinet secretary's righteous fury. The quiet little interrogation room was about to become the epicenter of an earthquake that would shake the entire airport to its foundations. The 15 minutes that followed were the most surreal of Dillon's life. Officer Miller, who had been laughing at him moments before, was now practically tripping over himself with apologies. "Mr. Hayes, there's been a terrible misunderstanding, a complete breakdown in communication. Sir, can I get you anything? Water, soda." Dillon just stared at him, too stunned to speak. Officer Dean stood rigidly in the corner, still holding the phone to his ear, occasionally murmuring, "Yes, Madam Secretary, and I understand, Madam Secretary." The men who had held all the power were now reduced to trembling sycophants, their authority stripped away by a single phone call. The first to arrive was not the head of security, but two people in sharp, dark suits, a man and a woman, who moved with an efficiency that was both impressive and intimidating. They were from Secretary Hayes's personal detail. They didn't speak to the officers. They spoke only to Dillon. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Agent Thompson. This is Agent Cole." The woman said, her voice calm and reassuring. "We're with your aunt. Are you all right? Have you been harmed in any way?" Dillon shook his head, finding his voice. "No, I'm okay. Just scared." "We understand," Agent Thompson said, her eyes briefly flicking toward the two officers with a look of pure ice. "You won't be in this room a moment longer." Just then, the door flew open again, and a procession of panicked-looking officials hurried in, their faces flushed. At the lead was a man Dillon recognized from the pictures on the airport walls, Marcus Thorne, the executive director of Dulles International Airport. Behind him was a woman in an Oceanic Airlines uniform, her face a mask of frantic distress. This was Eleanor Vance, the airline's senior vice president of North American operations. They had clearly been pulled from important meetings, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dread. Marcus Thorne's eyes landed on Dillon, then on the two stone-faced agents from the secretary's office. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his voice strained. "On behalf of the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, I want to offer my most profound and sincere apologies." He was cut off by Eleanor Vance of Oceanic Airlines, who pushed forward. "Mr. Hayes, I am utterly appalled at what you've endured. This is not who we are as an airline. The employees involved, their actions are inexcusable and will be dealt with in the most severe terms possible. We are so sorry." It was a dizzying reversal. An hour ago, he was a nameless, faceless suspect. Now he was Mr. Hayes, the center of a universe of frantic apologies from people whose names were on plaques and press releases. The real show, however, began when they were brought to the airline's first-class lounge, a place Dillon was supposed to have been relaxing in hours earlier. Waiting there were Karen, the flight attendant, and David, the gate agent. They had been pulled off the jet bridge just before the plane door closed, ordered by the captain to report to airport operations immediately with no explanation given. Seeing them now was a shock. Karen's smug, self-righteous composure had completely crumbled. Her face was pale, Her severe bun looked slightly askew, and her red lipstick was smudged. David just looked terrified, wringing his hands and avoiding eye contact with everyone. When Eleanor Vance saw them, her expression hardened. "Can either of you explain this?" she demanded, her voice low and furious. "Can you explain why the nephew of the Secretary of Transportation was accused of being a stowaway and handed over to the police?" Karen's eyes widened in disbelief as she looked at Dylan, then back at her boss. The dots connected in her mind with an audible click. "The Secretary of Transportation," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The story about the important aunt wasn't a lie. It was an understatement. She turned to Dylan, her face a pathetic mix of horror and a desperate fawning attempt at an apology. "Oh my God," she stammered, taking a step toward him. "Sir, young man, I am so sorry. I was just following procedure. We're trained to be vigilant, for security risks. I didn't mean, I never would have. You never would have what Karen—" Eleanor Vance cut her off, her voice dripping with contempt. "You never would have racially profiled a passenger if you knew he had powerful relatives. Is that the message, that our customer service is dependent on a background check of their family tree? You didn't see a first-class passenger. You saw a black teenager in a hoodie, and you decided he didn't belong. You invented a narrative of suspicion, ignored evidence to the contrary from the gate agent's own system, and bullied him into calling security. You didn't follow procedure. You followed your own ugly prejudice." Karen flinched, as if she'd been slapped. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Vance then turned her glare on David. "And you," she seethed. "You had the information right in front of you. A ticket purchased on a DOT corporate account. You could have de-escalated. You could have used common sense. But you let her walk all over you. You let this happen." David stared at the floor, mumbling, "I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do." The scene was a complete inversion of the one at the gate. The accusers were now the accused, squirming under the bright lights of consequence. Dylan watched not with a sense of triumph, but with a strange, hollow feeling. These people who had held such absolute power over him, who had made him feel so small and worthless, were now powerless themselves. Their apologies felt empty, born not of genuine remorse for what they had done, but of a desperate fear for their own jobs. The final and most powerful arrival was Selina Hayes herself. She swept into the lounge, not in a government motorcade, but quietly flanked only by her chief of staff. She exuded an aura of calm, controlled power that instantly silenced the room. She ignored the airline executives and the airport director completely. Her eyes went straight to Dylan. She walked over and wrapped him in a fierce hug. "Are you okay?" she murmured into his ear, her voice for him alone. "I'm okay now," he whispered back, melting into her embrace. After a long moment, she released him and turned to face the room. Her gaze settled on Karen and David. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "My nephew Hashmach," she said, her voice, clear and cold as a winter morning, was subjected to a humiliating and traumatic ordeal today because of the color of his skin. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a procedural error. This was discrimination, plain and simple. "And I can assure you, Ms. Vance," she said, finally acknowledging the airline executive, "this will not be dealt with internally. This is now a federal matter." The threat was unmistakable. This was no longer just about a ruined trip or a public apology. The full weight of the United States Department of Transportation was about to come crashing down on Oceanic Airlines. Karen and David's worlds had already imploded. Now the shockwave was about to hit their employer, In the days that followed, the story of what happened to Dylan Hayes at Dulles Airport didn't leak out in a torrent, but seeped into the public consciousness through carefully controlled channels. Secretary Selena Hayes was a master strategist, and she understood that a quiet, thorough, and official investigation would be far more devastating to Oceanic Airlines than a loud, messy media circus. She didn't want a fleeting scandal. She wanted systemic change, and she was going to use the full power of her office to get it. The first official notice came in the form of a letter hand-delivered to the office of Oceanic Airlines CEO Richard Sterling. It was from the Department of Transportation's Office of Aviation Consumer Protection, formally announcing a federal investigation into the airline's patterns and practices related to passenger discrimination in violation of Title 49 of the United States Code. The language was dry and bureaucratic, but its implications were chilling for the airline's legal team. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was the opening salvo of a war. For Karen, the flight attendant, the fallout was swift and brutal. She was called into a meeting with Eleanor Vance and a team of corporate lawyers. There was no discussion, no negotiation. Her 2 decades of service counted for nothing. She was presented with a list of her violations: failure to adhere to boarding protocols, harassment of a passenger, and making a false security report. Her actions had exposed the airline to catastrophic legal and financial liability. "But I was just being cautious," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "We're trained to look for anything out of the ordinary." "You weren't being cautious, Karen, you were being a bigot," Vance replied, her tone devoid of sympathy. "You saw a black child in first class and your brain malfunctioned. Your caution is about to cost this company millions of dollars in fines and damages, not to mention the reputational harm. You are terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." Karen's career, built over 20 years of flights and layovers, ended in 10 minutes. She was stripped of her credentials, her travel benefits, her pension. As she was walked out of the corporate headquarters, clutching a small box with her personal items, she was just another anonymous person on the street, her uniform and the power it conferred on her gone forever. The world she had lorded over from the door of an airplane had vanished. David, the gate agent, met a slightly different, though equally humiliating fate. The investigation revealed a history of complaints against him for poor customer service, and a tendency to avoid conflict by passing responsibility to others. He wasn't the instigator, but his passivity had enabled Karen's prejudice to escalate unchecked. He was demoted from his position as a gate agent to the baggage handling department. His new job involved loading and unloading suitcases onto the conveyor belt in the belly of the airport, a physically demanding, low-visibility role far from the public eye. Every day, as he heaved luggage onto the belt, he would see the Oceanic Airlines logo on the planes taxiing above, a constant reminder of the day he chose silence over integrity and ended his career trajectory in a nosedive. The consequences also rippled out to the MWAA police. Officers Miller and Dean were placed on administrative leave, pending an internal affairs investigation. Their blatant dismissal of Dylan's claims, their mockery of his aunt's identity, and their failure to perform even a basic verification check were deemed a gross dereliction of duty. The official report cited a severe lack of judgment and an unprofessional display of bias. They were ultimately suspended without pay for 6 months and relegated to desk duty upon their return, their chances of promotion or commendation permanently erased. Their condescending laughter in that small, windowless room had cost them dearly. But Secretary Hayes's objective went far beyond individual punishments. Her investigators descended on Oceanic Airlines headquarters like a swarm. They demanded years' worth of passenger complaint data, employee training manuals, hiring records, and internal communications. They interviewed dozens of employees, from flight attendants to executives. What they uncovered was a deeply ingrained systemic problem. The data showed a disproportionately high number of complaints filed by minority passengers, ranging from seating disputes to accusations of rude behavior from staff. These complaints were almost always dismissed with a form letter apology and a voucher for future travel. The airline's diversity and inclusion training was a joke, an outdated 20-minute video that employees clicked through once a year. There was no real accountability, no mechanism for identifying and addressing patterns of discriminatory behavior. Karen wasn't an anomaly. She was a symptom of a diseased corporate culture. The findings of the DOT investigation were compiled into a scathing 200-page report that was leaked to the press. The story exploded. News outlets ran headlines like "Prejudice at 30,000 feet, dot slams, Oceanic Airlines for more systemic discrimination," and "Stowaway accusation against Cabinet Secretary's nephew uncovers rot at major airline." The public backlash was immense. Boycotts were organized. Celebrities and politicians publicly announced they would no longer fly Oceanic. The airline's stock price plummeted, wiping out hundreds of millions of dollars in market value in a single week. The karma for that one ugly glance at the boarding gate was not just personal, it was corporate, financial, and utterly devastating. The airline that had allowed prejudice to fester in its ranks was now paying the price on a scale its executives could never have imagined. The fallout for Oceanic Airlines was far from over. The Department of Transportation, armed with the damning findings of its investigation, levied one of the largest fines in aviation history against the carrier for civil rights violations. The multi-million-dollar penalty was not just punitive. It was a clear signal to the entire industry that the era of ignoring passenger discrimination was over. But Secretary Selene Hayes knew that a fine, no matter how large, was just money. True change required something more. As part of a consent decree to avoid further federal action, Oceanic Airlines was forced to enter into a legally binding agreement that would put it under strict DOT oversight for the next 5 years. The terms were non-negotiable and sweeping in their scope. The airline was mandated to completely overhaul its employee training programs from the ground up. They hired a leading civil rights consulting firm to develop a new intensive multi-day training curriculum focused on implicit bias de-escalation and cultural competency. It was made mandatory for every single employee, from the CEO down to the baggage handlers. Failure to complete and pass the course was grounds for immediate termination. Furthermore, the airline was required to establish a new independent Office of Civil Rights Compliance within its corporate structure. This office, which reported directly to the board of directors and the DOT, was tasked with transparently investigating every single passenger complaint of discrimination. The old system of form letters and travel vouchers was dismantled. Now every accusation was to be thoroughly examined with real consequences for employees found to have acted improperly. The airline also had to implement a data tracking system to monitor complaints and identify employees or airports with recurring problems, ensuring that individuals like Karen could no longer operate with impunity for years on end. The changes were painful, expensive, and met with grumbling resistance from some long-time employees. But the alternative, facing a complete revocation of their operating certificate from the DOT, was unthinkable. Oceanic Airlines, once a symbol of casual corporate arrogance, was being forcibly remade into a model of accountability. For Dylan, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but he was undeniably changed by the experience. The rescheduled trip to Portland was fun, but the shadow of the incident at Dulles lingered. He found himself more anxious in crowded spaces, more wary of authority figures. The naive trust he once had in the world had been fractured, but alongside the fear was a new, steely resolve. He had never sought the spotlight, but the story in its broad strokes became public knowledge. He began receiving messages from people all over the country, sharing their own stories of being mistreated or discriminated against while traveling. He read stories from a Sikh man who was repeatedly, randomly selected for extra screening, a Latina woman who was berated by a flight attendant for speaking Spanish to her child, and a disabled passenger who was left stranded on a plane for an hour after everyone else had deplaned. He realized his ordeal was not an isolated event. It was a single visible manifestation of a much larger, often invisible problem. With his aunt's encouragement, Dylan decided to use his unintentional platform for good. He started a blog and a social media channel called Fly with Dignity, where he shared his story and curated the stories of others. He wasn't a politician or an activist, but his voice as a young person who had been through the fire resonated powerfully. He spoke to student groups and youth organizations, advocating for kindness, awareness, and the courage to speak up against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. He became an accidental advocate, turning his trauma into a tool for empowerment. The incident also subtly reshaped his relationship with his Aunt Selene. He had always known she was important and powerful, but now he understood the true nature of that power, not just the ability to command and regulate, but the ability to protect, to seek justice, and to force meaningful change. He saw her not just as his loving aunt, but as a guardian, not only for him, but for the principles of fairness and equality she championed in her public life. Years later, the Oceanic Airlines decree became a landmark case study in corporate reform. Other airlines, seeing the devastating financial and reputational damage Oceanic had suffered, began proactively updating their own training and complaint procedures. The industry as a whole became more attentive, more aware. The changes weren't perfect, and prejudice wasn't eradicated overnight, but the needle had moved. Dylan Hayes never wanted to be a symbol. He just wanted to go on vacation. But because of the ugly prejudice of one flight attendant, the cowardly silence of one gate agent, and the blind arrogance of two police officers, he became one. His story served as a permanent reminder of a simple, powerful truth that every passenger has a right to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what they look like, what they wear, or where they sit on the plane. And sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air, a storm that began with a single demeaning glance and ended with a phone call that held an entire industry to account. The story of Dylan Hayes is a stark reminder that prejudice isn't just an abstract concept, it has real devastating consequences. One person's bias left unchecked can spiral into a nightmare. But this story is also about the incredible power of truth and accountability. The moment one brave phone call was made, the tables turned, and a system that allowed discrimination to fester was brought to its knees. Justice may not always be this swift or dramatic, but it serves as a powerful example of what happens when we refuse to be silenced. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story. What are your thoughts on this? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Share your story in the comments below. Let's keep this important conversation going.